So I'm going to be honest with you. I was a little nervous about where we were going to go with this. We didn't have any trouble talking about all kinds of interesting things last time.
That's
So
right.
I can't see why we wouldn't also have a lot of interesting things to share this time as well. We set a pretty, I think, high bar for what we're trying to do, which is to come up with a format to work together on issues that we might disagree on. Is that how you remember leaving things?
Yeah, I think, and also with, as you would agree, I'm sure a constructive goal of trying to build a framework around some of the things where we can come together, exploring disagreements that may arise, and building a framework, but also show, that we can come together and try to talk through things constructively with a goal or a solution in mind.
Yeah, no, I think it's a wonderful goal that we set for
I think
ourselves.
so.
So
Yeah.
should we, I basically just copied what I had sent you in the email in terms of an introduction. Did you have, but we don't have to go through that whole thing. How would you like to
No, I
introduce
think,
yourself?
I'm as we've discussed, I'm a venture capital attorney by trade, with a passion and interest in a lot of prior work and advocacy work in mental health and addictions. A lot of which stems from the way that so many people get into that type of work through personal experience. And so I think deeply about these issues. I'm very concerned about the well-being of others, and I want to make sure that as time goes on, we're moving in a direction that promotes healing and wellness. And sometimes I'm concerned that in modern culture we may not be going in that direction. But rather than succumbing to fears, I want to try to work through that constructively and find a hopeful framework that people uh, can can find themselves in.
Yep, that sounds like what we talked about. And, I'll just say that I'm a psychoanalyst and a psychologist. I've been working for over 30 years now in the field. And before that, I was a sign language interpreter, and I worked in a variety of settings. I think I mentioned to you that I come from a family, a Jewish family. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where I was one of only two Jewish kids in the school. And that while my family was very culturally Jewish, not religious, as a matter of fact, my mother, who's 100 years old, is a confirmed atheist. And and so that's always been my perspective as well. I have a brother 3 years older than me that has a severe mental illness, and that's been a big motivation for me to get into the field, because he and both of my parents were in psychoanalytic treatment for most of his adolescence while he was institutionalized. And I was the quote normal one, but subsequent to that, I have clocked more therapy hours than all of them put together. It's my training as a psychologist. So I love talking to people who have different views than myself. Maybe it has something to do with growing up in a town where I was a minority, and liked to share views with other people who felt differently than I did. So I'm looking forward to continuing our dialogue.
And I would say to that too, a little more background on me too, and I share in that interest and enjoyment in talking to people of different backgrounds and just having an open exchange of ideas. For me, growing up in Bergen County, New Jersey, just always having New York City right there available to me, and also having the chance to travel all over the world in various ways, being a part of experiencing different cultures and backgrounds, and talking to people from all different walks of life has always been something that I've enjoyed doing. And I find that as much as we celebrate diversity, and we should, I also find that it reveals hard work, because you actually have to, love and talk to people and engage and be in open relationship with people who are, come from different walks of life. And eventually, if you're going to have relationship with people, that eventually reveals hard work. It's nice to just say it as a tagline or something that feels good to people, or that is a signal, but the actual work of diversity is actually challenging yet worthwhile.
Yes, as a matter of fact, this is reminding me of another reason why probably I like to talk to people who are different from me. Although my husband and I, we've been married since 1978, so 40 plus years of marriage, and we're together for 5 years before that. We have a huge fight at least once a day. We don't agree on anything. And yet we're still together. So
which is beautiful. I'm 4 years in as of this week, so I am 1/10 of the way there. So now I have to ask you, like, what is the secret? What sustains a marriage? Because it's so important. It's I think it's a very important building block that people should strive for to the extent possible. So I'd be curious, what makes it work for 40 years, as I learn myself.
Well, we have a lot of fun with each other when we're not fighting. We do enjoy each other's company. And to get back to one of the things that we started talking about at the end of our conversation, I hope this isn't too much information, we have a good sexual relationship, and we enjoy that with each other, and it comes from a loving place. And that has been incredibly sustaining. I think that's a big part of it.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I agree. And I know that is something we were talking about. We were talking about sex ed curriculums in schools, and that was one of the areas we wanted to further explore. And if I may jump in, I think that's it's a great segue, because I was just looking and preparing for further discussion. I was looking at like the sex ed standards for like organizations that are trying to set what they think a curriculum should look like, that's probably informing what the sex ed curriculums in public schools are today. I read through it, and a lot of times I don't want to just react to what I see there that I don't necessarily like, but I want to also think about what I think is absent. And so what you just described about 40 years having a good sex life in a marriage, and how that's been so valuable to you, and for personal and collective fulfillment and joy. I read through this sex ed curriculum, and after I got done with it, I'm like, I don't know why anyone would want to have sex. It was all doom and gloom.
Well, that's interesting. I did not even know that there was a quote sex curriculum that was so universalized. I thought
I don't really want to say it's universalized, because I'm sure that different standards are adopted in different school districts and things like that. But this is a national advocacy group that has taken feedback in from all these different organizations and academics and activist groups, and they've put together this sort of standard of best practices. And you can imagine that that's informing different curriculums. So they're holding themselves out as sort of a national standard.
I see. Just so I could maybe have a chance to look it up myself, what's the name of the organization?
I'm going to pull it up right now. I have it open on my phone. So what I was reading was this is the National Sex Education Standards, Core Content and Skills K through 12, second edition, from the Future of Sex Education. It looks like it's sort of housed by the Advocates for Youth organization, with also an organization, CSIS, Sex Ed for Social Change. And if you look through its contributors and reviewers, you have academics from a lot of different universities, and you have different representatives from different organizations. So I think that among there's things that I'm not saying don't have a place, like things about consent, right? We should talk about consent. That's something I would agree should be discussed, and sexual violence that may exist. but you read through and there's nothing about even pleasure really. It's
Really?
about no, it's I mean, I guess there's mechanics on how to do it, but there's so much about gender expression and gender identity and HIV and which is obviously different. I'm kind of just speaking out loud, but about sexual violence, things that could go wrong, about equity, about racial justice, about social justice, and the again, the thing that first off alarmed me is nowhere in this is the word love. You could read 40 pages and you won't see the word love. There's a reference to healthy relationships, but no love. There's talk about,
I wonder why that is. That's really interesting.
it is. Because I want to focus on what's missing. I don't want to give the Republican talking points, which I'd be happy to give, but I'd rather go beyond those and talk about.
Let's hear those first. Let's hear those first, just so I know what they are.
Well, I think it's wow, we're really talking more and sexualizing our children younger and younger. You'd look at this curriculum and the things that I'll just read it, so I'm not talking out of turn, because I might as well just read it off here. By the end of second, I mean, this is something that a conservative viewpoint would pick out as maybe a concern. By the end of second grade, students should be able to list medically accurate names for body parts, including the genitals. Maybe parents are not necessarily comfortable in their public school with their teachers talking to their children that are 6 or 7 years old about that topic. By the end of second grade, students should be able to define gender, gender identity, and gender role stereotypes, discuss the range of ways people express their gender and how gender role stereotypes may limit behavior, define reproduction, and explain that all living things have the capacity to reproduce.
And that's by the end of what year?
Second grade.
Second grade also.
Again, I'm picking the things that I think would be
the most
controversial.
Yeah.
By the end of fifth grade, students should be able to explain common human sexual development and the role of hormones, examples, romantic and sexual feelings, masturbation, mood swings, timing of pubertal onset.
So there is something in there about affection, or I think I heard you say something, but it seems like it's sort of sidelined.
Romantic and sexual feelings.
Yes.
Right.
Not love per se.
Or one more I'll read here. I think this would concern parents, some parents. By the end of fifth grade, students should be able to distinguish between sex assigned at birth and gender identity and explain how they may or may not differ. Define and explain differences between cisgender, transgender, gender non-binary, gender expansive, and gender identity. Explain that gender and gender expression and gender identity may exist along a spectrum.
It's very much focused on gender and not that much on sexuality, and certainly not on love at all.
Right, which it's their effort to be inclusive, but right. In doing that, we're kind of, again, I think we need to go back to basics to start. Like, one of the things we were discussing last time is, this is my view, is we shouldn't even be talking about this topic at all until we talk about love.
Mm-hmm.
To me, from my viewpoint, if in a world where a lot of children, for any variety of reasons, are not feeling loved, and to me, love is so essential to interpersonal connection and spiritual development, I think that making a strong effort to have love education before we have sex education would be beneficial, not just in the context of talking about sex, but we should talk about love education for a whole variety of benefits to well-being. And then once we have that foundation, then I think we can start to have a conversation about what should sex education look like. And, I may not support going into detail about all of those things, or I might want there to still be parental exemptions, or parents can opt out on behalf of their children or whatnot. But the point is, I think that we should do love education. And then before we get into sort of the details of sex, let's first, I think to your point earlier, like, why is it what does it mean? Why is it it's a magical thing? It is magical in the sense that the act of sex creates life. There's, again, you can't find that anywhere in the sex ed curriculum, but I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how we've become so sanitized. I actually read that and it feels prudish to me because
That's so
the sex is
interesting.
missing.
Yeah, right. It's like it's not sexy.
No. And again, what I think is, like, we can talk about sex, but to me, it should be done in a proper context. Maybe we'll debate that a bit, but like, it's not, you're right, it's not sexy.
So how, yeah, I don't mean to put so much of the pressure on you to come forth with the format here, but I'm intrigued with the idea of love education. I am particularly interested in the way you connected that up with children who do not feel loved. And I'm wondering what that would look like. What would we be teaching children about love? We're talking about second graders.
Right. I think first off, we should talk about what is love. Start there. Now, you know, we're gonna. It's hard to pinpoint a definition on that. I have one in mind that isn't mine, but it belongs to the psychiatrist M. Scott Peck. Published it in the 1970s, while also conceding that his definition of love is not perfect. But I'll share it.
Okay, go ahead. And before you do that, let me just say it's something really obvious, that what love means to a second grader is very different from what love might mean to an eighth grader, for example.
That's right. And so I'll say the definition, and then I'm going to like backtrack from it. So his definition was the will to extend oneself for one's own or another's spiritual growth. And he would say that part of the key there is the will. So love is not a feeling, but it's an action. Now, we could debate the merits of whether that's a good definition or not. I also think, to your point, like, how, you know, starting a framework of love is like also, as we're talking to a second grader or an eighth grader, and it should be developmentally appropriate. You know, I think that we have so much wisdom in human history and in faith traditions and in philosophy and other sources where, you know, we can look that there are different types of love. There's brotherly love. There's romantic love. There's agape love, just a you know, a feeling of love for the other, so to speak. You know, we could look at the different types of love. We could look at what love is and what love isn't. We could look at how to love oneself, how to do the work of self-love. We can, as you get older, maybe some of those things from the sex ed curriculum around that even start to touch into healthy relationships and consent and those types of issues, or abusive relationships. Maybe there's a segment in love education that at a certain developmentally appropriate point deals with that in a trauma-informed way.
Well, let me just disagree with something. We have to disagree. That's what we're here to do, is disagree. That does seem very, very broad. And again, to get back to the second grader that's having pleasurable feelings in their genital areas, how does one address that?
Well, I guess it's also a question of what, like, is it the schools, or like, I know, because we're talking about like curricula, right? So
right.
So this is not
not just pleasurable sensations, but getting, you know, second graders can get crushes on each other. So like, let's say a little boy that gets a crush on somebody and they feel pleasurable sensations in their genital area. Like, what do you do with that in sex ed or love ed?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how second graders, I don't know how they define that. I don't know. I don't recall experiencing that, I guess, in second grade, but that's just me. I'm not Not saying that others don't, of course.
I think I had a boyfriend when I was in second grade. I'm not sure, but I think I did.
uh, so I mean, I think though, at least, I mean, if we're not talking about that now, what harm has been caused by not talking about that in second grade? Like we don't have, that's the thing. We may not have to teach and explain everything either.
I'm not, since I came from a family that was fairly open talking about sex. And my husband and I spoke pretty openly with our children about it. I always went on the criterion that when a child expresses any kind of curiosity, whether it's verbally expressing it or demonstrating a curiosity about their body non-verbally, that's the point where you would want to provide some information. And the rule of thumb is that you give enough information that satisfies the question. You don't have to go way beyond what the question is. But I know that there are lots of families where sex and loving feelings and attraction aren't talked about at all. I mean, I hear about this. I mentioned this to you before. What particularly comes to mind are the ultra-Orthodox Jewish people that I've worked with who have told me they had absolutely no conversation about it whatsoever and no preparation, and got married after a couple of dates when they were 18 years old, and then were expected to perform sexually with each other, and that it was described as actually a traumatic experience. But let's not, that's an extreme situation. But let's take the little boy or the little girl who's touching themselves, and their parent smacks their hand and says that's dirty. I think that the early sex education is in part aimed at trying to mitigate those kinds of shame experiences about your body.
So I think, like, yeah, I'm not of the view that we should be wanting to shame children, right, for things that are emerging. I think that these things are also, I don't want to talk about them for a second. We can go back to it, but I don't want to necessarily talk about it in the school context, because I think like these are exactly the types of things that are going to be addressed differently from family to family, household to household. Families are going to have personal preferences and cultural and religious preferences as to how they want to handle that. And whether we agree with those things or not, they're not necessarily things that a curriculum or the state or should necessarily be getting in the weeds of. These are things that kind of have to be worked out among cultures.
So I would agree with that up to one point.
Right.
No conversation about it I would say is unacceptable.
But okay, but in where, right? Because we still have to define the location in the home. Okay.
Yeah, to have no conversation, I would say, is a bad thing.
As a general like principle. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So then it always becomes this thing of like, if we let's take that as true, right? It's still, as I'm sure you would agree, just practically speaking, it's going to, we can't regulate that, right? We could try to, if that's your view, then we could try to inform people as to view it differently from no conversation. It's just, these are some of these questions that it's like, there may be a subset of the population that, going back to systems for a second, that would like to impose more regulation or more discussion or more teaching upon families to try to get an outcome that they desire that might be at odds with the outcome that family wants, whether we think that family is right or wrong in that. And so I guess what I'm saying is it's very hard to come up with a framework in that space, because it's such a very personal and internal kind of thing.
No, I totally agree with you. Like, and I'm imagining do you have small kids yet?
Yeah, 2 and 4 months.
Yeah. Oh, right,
to
right,
4
right.
months.
So I'm putting myself in your place and I'm imagining how you would feel, given what you've told me, to have your child come home and tell you, well, I learned all this about gender identity in second grade. That would be a very negative experience for you.
Yeah, I would not be pleased with that, and I because I don't think that it's the time, and we haven't established the framework to then talk about other things like that.
Right. But I also, even knowing you a little bit, I'm quite sure that by the time your children are in second grade, you'll have started a conversation with them.
um, yeah, that's age appropriate about age appropriate things, and as things come up, we're not living in isolation, so as things come up, and I guess this is your point to an extent, right? Like, no one wants to shame.
That's not
Uh,
true. Some
okay,
people
sorry.
just want to,
In this discussion, the goal is
neither of us want to. We agree about that.
right, but there has to be some way to sort of, not, like you said, not give more attention than is due to something that might be innocent, while still sort of guiding something accordingly in a way that's constructive and leads to the uh, development of positive feelings and healthy relationships.
Now, I mean, I think what this comes down to, the way I'm hearing your positions, it sounds like you don't feel the school has should have a role in this. And I guess where I'm coming from is, I would be okay with that as long as the families were really on board with taking this up, but there's no way to really know whether that's going on or not.
There isn't. So I think it's a good point. Like, I'm my view is I don't want it before love education. But although
Uh-huh.
I know I don't want to get hung up on that, because then we're saying, well, second grade things. But okay, so let me backtrack. I'm not saying the school can't have any role. There may be a way in a framework where a school could have a role, because uh, I'm not saying ban sex education, just to be clear, right? What I am saying is that the parent ultimately should make the decision, and um, it's a lot of times the parent may not necessarily, the parent who might have these concerns about what's being taught in the school may not even be aware that it's being taught in the school. And so a lot of times it's viewed, and now I'm getting political for a second, back to that,
Okay, go ahead.
it's viewed as sort of the arch conservative, white family, very Christian, is very up in arms about what's being taught in the school. That's sometimes a left-wing criticism of what's happening, and that should just be ignored. uh that they should ignore the views of that type of critic. But a lot of times I also think that it's families that are first generation in this country, that come to this country for opportunity, who also have different values that they're bringing here. They come with their own traditions and their own values that also sometimes are at odds with this sort of free expression of sexual education in schools. And they might be, everybody has different economic conditions, but maybe they are uh, busy at work. They're not necessarily as attuned to what's going on in the curriculum, and then these things kind of slide in there, and they may not have the same level of awareness always, as as another family might. And I think that if everyone had, let's say that what we were talking about earlier was the curriculum for this example. I think that if everyone saw, this is what's happening in the schools, this is what's being taught in the schools, it wouldn't just be, the arch conservative white family being concerned. It would be people from all walks of life. A very diverse group of people would be very concerned about this curriculum. And so, and it's also this idea that it's so new that we would have in human history. It's so new that we would have a secular institution, the public school in this instance, that would be tasked, and that a state would even pass laws about how to do this, that we would have a secular institution teaching these kinds of things to children about sex that and family life in many ways. That's a new phenomenon that only comes about in recent decades. That hasn't existed for the entirety of even public schools in this country. This is a more new phenomenon. Again, I'm not saying we ban it, but it's not like it's been here since the beginning of time either.
No, I remember when I was in 7th grade, there was an assembly for girls. And we went in there and we came out with our little packets with our, Kotex, and the boys didn't know what was going on. And that was sex ed.
And then the boys had some version, or did they not?
I
I don't
don't
know. No one talked about it.
there wasn't much conversation about it, but I just saw, did you read the Elena Ferrante novels? They're called the Neapolitan novels, My Brilliant Friend. Did you see? Oh, they're really fantastic. But anyways, I was watching there was a movie, a TV series made of them, and it's about these two girls who were friends throughout their lifetime and their relationship. And there's a scene in which one of them gets her period and she thinks she's dying. This takes place in Naples, probably in the early 1960s. And what concerns me about not providing this is the vulnerability and the possibility of being exploited, mistreated, really abused if you don't have the information about what's going on.
And I share that concern, and I don't want that to happen either. And something like natural processes of reproduction, which a period would be into. I mean, we teach health. That is something that I don't think should be controversial in teaching in a health class. And it's the natural process of life, just as sex is a natural process of life.
Mm-hmm.
I think the issue, because I don't think that would be, I could be wrong, but certainly I don't feel that's that controversial. It shouldn't be controversial. That should be
to teach
talk about.
basic,
and men should know about how menstruation works, and women should. I mean, there should not be any controversy there.
Yeah.
If there is, I'm not for it. We should be able to do that, because it is important, and that's health information. That's health literacy. I think where the controversy starts to happen, and maybe it's good that you brought that up, because maybe we can start to form a distinction, is it's the fact that, like, we can understand sex as reproduction, but it also has a sort of a deeper meaning, of course.
Yeah.
Of course. And I think that where we start to talk about, like, I want to, like, think about this carefully, and it's, we're brainstorming. And so,
right.
It's sort of because it is special, because sex is precious and it is special, and it has a magical component, and it leads to reproduction, and it has consequences. I think because of the elevated, unique nature of it, that maybe that is where some of the sort of debate and even controversy emerges, because, again, people from different backgrounds are going to have a different view on how we should properly harness that. And I also think that, we are collectively in a new kind of social experiment around sex in the last 50, 60 years relative to human history, as a result of birth control, which, again, I don't oppose. I'm generally of the view that maybe we should make birth control over the counter if it's safe to do it. So I'm not against birth control, but we should acknowledge that it is yet another example of humanity where we have technology or medicine, let's just call it technology, right? The birth control pill or birth control methods are a form of small t technology that has changed the way that sex is socialized, because now you can have, theoretically at least, you could have sex without some of the likelihood of consequence that may have occurred prior to the advent of this technology. And so what that does is it changes the way that this form of technology has changed the ways that humans are connecting with one another. And technology has advanced, but emotional intelligence has not advanced. And so it's yet another example of technology advancing at a greater pace than emotional intelligence. And so now what we're trying to do, I mean, even in these curricula, like we're sitting here talking about how to put a condom on. I'm not saying that doesn't have a place, but what I'm saying is like the conversation becomes about sort of all the consent, which we should talk about, but the interpersonal nature of negotiating sex like it's a transactional item, the mechanics of sex, which, you know, there's reproduction, and we should talk about that. That's as established, but also, like, you know, the different birth control methods and all the different ways you can do it, and all, you know, and all the different ways you can try to prevent pregnancy and all of those things. It's like we're moving away from the very real magical aspect that also carries real consequences about how humans interact with one another.
I hear what you're saying. Okay, there's two things I'm hearing. One is that the sex education as put forth in the curriculum that you were looking at doesn't really focus on the amazing result of sex between I mean, I'm not even sure what the right terms are. Two people of opposite sex, when they come together, they can produce life, and that is amazing.
Yeah.
And that should be celebrated.
Celebrated,
And
yes.
it should be focused on. It should, and that is one thing. And also the pleasure and the love that you get, whether or not you're ending up with the baby, is another result of sexual interaction between people that should be celebrated and should be enjoyed and appreciated. And those two things are missing from the curricula that you have.
Yeah, I think so. I think you know, it's that's what's interesting in trying to be sometimes you know, or again, or another thing you'll see is, like, it's not in this curriculum, but I've read, like, you know, trying to have porn literacy among young people.
Mhm.
You know, I guess because if young people are watching pornographic material at a greater rate than maybe in the past, partly because it's so accessible, they're getting a very distorted view of the reality of sex, and sometimes it, you know, very well may have it might depict violence and other things that I don't see as having a place necessarily. Not necessarily, I don't see having a place. And so but it's like then we got to have porn literacy so we could focus on reforming what people are seeing in pornographic images, so that they have come closer to a sense of reality. Like we just start to get further into the weeds about taking things that are a little bit broken or very broken and then trying to fix them. But we need to just go back to basics and talk about.
Can you just tell me what porn literacy is? I don't even know what that is.
Well, it's the idea that we're going to in the same way that they have media literacy, right? Where you would you would look at I'm not saying they look at porn in the porn literacy class. I don't know what they do. But in media literacy, you factor in the idea that the media puts forth a number of images that are not always based in reality, right? And so the images that people are taking in media might impact how they view their own body image or things like that. And so you would give people the discernment to have a little bit more ability to critically think when they're viewing media images or they're just surrounded by media images.
So it's like being able to distinguish fantasy from reality, really.
Yeah.
What it comes down to, which is, I think that's the big problem for porn for a lot of younger people, is maybe older people too, I don't know, but the idea that what you're seeing is a sexual fantasy being acted out. It's not necessarily what people want to do with each other.
Right. And so we could go down all these types of rabbit holes and try to, or we could kind of go back to basics and talk about, since the beginning of time, what uh, what sex in its miraculous component represents, and also then in the consequences that exist. We talked about, birth control prevents I don't want to call it well, okay, it's a consequence of pregnancy, right? I mean, it's a beautiful, life is beautiful, but it's a consequence that's disproportionately placed on the woman, who has to carry the pregnancy. The man can run off and not really be involved if that's what they choose. um where was I going with this? um
Let's see
I do know. So, but also the emotional aspects, and this is also the question of, should we, there's an emotional component. And also, when you look at some of the data from recent decades, you have the advent of the sexual revolution. Men get to continue to sort of pursue, there's a stronger market to now justify their behavior in some ways, because if they were, let's call them the hornier sex by nature, perhaps, now if women feel, based on, again, the media images they're taking in and the sexual revolution, that they have to participate in that to get a man, or that they should feel free to participate in that if they so choose on their own volition. The problem is that's actually not a lot of what, maybe not everyone, I can't speak for everyone, but I think that a plurality of women don't actually want that necessarily. I don't think they, if you look at the rates of orgasm between men and women in one night stands, women orgasm far, very little relative to men, and may be left with a lack of pleasure, and b, some feelings of emotional vulnerability. They're not necessarily pleasant, but we've kind of created this condition where, because we're not respecting the magic of sex, and we're not talking about love, and we're not setting up those foundations, we have all these distortions going on.
So one thing I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm very interested in the hookup literature also. I thought this was an interesting piece of information that came out of one of the research studies. Yes, the same thing, that women were much less likely to have an orgasm during a hookup than a man. But that if a woman was with a woman, it got more equal. So that sort of brings in the factor of understanding the other person's body and being sensitive to it, and maybe being skilled also. So, so then we kind of go back to education, that apparently women are interested in hookups if they are finding the sex to be really pleasurable, and if they have an orgasm, then they would positively endorse the idea of a hookup.
Okay. I don't know. I does that. It personally goes against my beliefs about what I think the emotional well-being, that lasting connection, would provide individuals.
Totally agree with that.
Yeah, because right, and so that's the thing, is like, it can't just be this sort of transactional commodity between people. It has this, again, a magical and spiritual component. And so I think when people are conservative about sex, what sometimes they're doing is they're just trying to preserve it for a proper context, so that it maintains meaning.
Well, let me ask you a question, because I agree with you about the magical quality of sex producing life. That is amazing. But I also think that there's another magical quality of sex that doesn't have anything to do with reproduction. It just has to do with feeling good about your body, feeling good about the other person, bringing you closer to the other person. And that is the area where it feels to me there's not enough sex education.
So I guess then, like, in general, I'm not even, let's keep the curriculum out of this for a moment because we
Okay.
can bring that back. But like, yeah, I don't, that can certainly be a benefit as well. And certainly something that in people's marriages, they should feel free to explore to the extent they wish, of course. And
Also, there are a lot of people that can't reproduce, like people of the same sex, when they have sex with each other, they're not going to reproduce.
so I think, again, I think there's, but you know, I think that it the enjoyment is, there's going to be people who disagree with me, but the enjoyment comes from, I think, connection forming first. I think that's you know, and certainly I think if we did a research study, we could call, I would call that an evidence-based best practice. You know, because I think that if we pulled enough people with enough experiences, that's the kind of consensus that I believe would form. And so I don't have any opposition to talking about that either. It's just, again, I think it's just about, I'll bring the curriculum back for a second.
Okay.
I think it's about, again, what is the proper order of discussing these things? When should we discuss them? What's the appropriate space to discuss them? How do we make sure that, you know, we're not just doing lip service to people's cultural and religious values, that we're actually making sure that we're not violating anyone's conscience? And
Well, I don't, I'm glad, I feel like we're maybe heading towards where we disagree with each other, which is a good thing. Your point of view is really focused on reproductive sex. And I think I'm interested in, find that very important, but I also think non-reproductive sex is a very important area where people should get educated. That's one thing. The other, and to feel good about, however, assuming that what you want to do isn't illegal, like having sex with children or something like that, children should grow up feeling like whatever attractions they have, whatever gets them off is okay, as long as they're not hurting anybody. Where was I going to go with that? About, I can't remember where it was going with it. All right, go ahead.
no,
Reaction to that.
Well,
I know what it was. You said going against people's values, but do you differentiate the values of the parents from the values of the child?
Well, I think that I can't have any intervening. I can't have any institution intervene in this. In the parents should be able to have just to a great extent, not an absolute extent, because child abuse would not fall into this category, of course. But like, parents should in a free society be able to bring up their children as they wish, and the state, no institution can really interfere in that. So, in that sense, I'm more concerned with protecting the ways in which parents wish to raise their children, and if there are problems with that, it has to be addressed at an individual or community level rather than a governmental level.
What about conversion therapy? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that we see that that's produced harmful effects for children, and so on children under 18, and with enough research, we've moved away from that. I know in the state of New Jersey, we banned that under a Republican governor, even, and so I don't wish to open that back up.
Well, there are parents that would definitely want that for their kids.
Well, right, but I think that there's a degree of going to a location of that sort. I mean, it's very programmatic. It's very institutional. It's going to a camp or going to some other kind of very intense setting, and it doesn't work. So
we agree on that.
So there's really nothing left to say about it.
Well, except that, this is, I think, where if I were going to say there was one point of disagreement that seems obvious to me is the role of the parents, and how influential should they be in educating their children about sexuality?
Well, the question is how would you choose to regulate that, I suppose?
It's very difficult.
Right.
Even if you have a curriculum that you and I both 100% would endorse, that doesn't mean they're not going to go home and get a different message.
Right. And what I, as a sort of, I'll kind of mix my political views here as that's kind of the reality of limited government, is that it's, when you think about these types of political philosophies, just stay on that for a moment, like, it's the idea that are human beings inherently social where they can work out their own issues without the need for some sort of intervention, or are humans inherently corrupt where they need another body of humans who are, in my view, also probably corrupt to try to come in and regulate them? I mean, that's what it ultimately comes back down to. I tend to be of the view that it's, humans kind of have to, because when you try to impose certain things, you get a bunch of resistance anyway. So, my thing is, you kind of work these things out over time. And humans are social, and ideally we move forward in a direction that's constructive. And I don't, I don't even know how you get in the middle of that kind of stuff, nor do I necessarily want to. And I also think that, there's also so many degrees of it, right? It's like there's going to be the parent who's doing the shaming, and then there's going to be the parent who's doing something that the most sort of sort of free expressive kind of thing. I don't know what the right word is. And then there's a lot of moderation in the middle. So you can't even regulate that because everybody's doing it a little. I mean, we can't regulate human behavior to that degree. What we have is a free society where, and that's probably the best thing, where people can discuss and debate, and we don't have, no one's regulating our speech or our discussion here. We're having a discussion and ideas are being shared, and that's the best we can do.
Well, that makes me think that if we were going to come up with a framework, if we were in charge of how this was going to play out in the schools, that we would want to have discussion rather than, teaching particular things, maybe posing some scenarios. I mean, it sounds like you would agree that there's some basic information that children should have.
Yes.
And if they're not getting it from their parents, they should get that information from the school. Would you agree with that?
I would.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that because it's more or less accepted that sex ed exists in our public schools. Like I don't really think there's going to be a popular policy platform to eliminate sex ed, nor would I support it. What I think, though, is that if we focused, like, the things about love or the things about the magical nature of sex, I think these things would be perhaps whole better if they were injected into curriculum than some of the things that are actually getting their way into the curriculum or even currently exist in the curriculum. Like, that's what I think is actually what the framework we could come up with would actually be more popular than what exists now.
Because it would lead with things that were more organically experienced by the children.
Yes, and the adults understand it. Like, these are inherently human qualities. We'd be bringing the human condition back to this topic, and we would, in my view, would be, parents, as they can now in sex ed curriculums in most places, they could opt out of things, and the kids could opt out if they wish, and that's how you protect parents' interests ultimately. But like, but the point is, I think actually you'd have, if parents knew what the type of thing we could come up with, I think fewer would opt out, because maybe you'd be less concerned about, oh, my kid's learning in I don't know, high school somewhere is learning how to put on a condom. Maybe that's not as controversial when you just have this foundation of love education and all of this stuff that comes first.
Create a context for all of this.
I think then the condom is not as I don't know if the condom is the thing that's controversial in 2023. There are things that are more controversial. But I think, like, Yeah, and moderating that, maybe some things don't have to be learned in second grade. It'd be my view.
Mhm.
Um,
Do you have any thoughts about what the love curriculum would look like?
yeah, so like I threw out some initial ideas earlier. Like it would actually happen separate of sex ed, right?
Okay.
You shouldn't even think of them as, let's think of them as two separate entities.
Okay.
We've been discussing them because in my view it should come before sex ed, but let's just imagine love ed and for the moment, because love is broader than sex, right? Love is a powerful force that brings peace to this world, binds people, connects people, forms heals trauma. Magical things happen with love too. And for all the things that we teach, how great would it be if we could approach problem solving from a perspective of love? And then as you get older, like imagine a middle school, like you could inject love into a policy debate. I'm making this up offhand, right? But
Right.
like maybe, and this is all in good faith, maybe a a more progressive, if we're having a policy or political debate in middle school, let's say maybe the progressive wing of the debate would be, well, we have to love our neighbor more, so we need maybe we need government to be providing more assistance in certain places, and that's an expression of love. And maybe somebody else on the conservative side would say, well, love is not creating dependency on people, and that's a concern if we do that, and so we have to help people have more individual agency over their lives, and that's a form of love. And basically we'd have policy discussions based on love as a sort of the framework. That would be nice. That'd be better than what we have now.
I guess what I'm hearing is, and I agree with this also, is a lot of the way things are set up now, there's no room for any kind of debate or disagreement. It's just, this is the curriculum, and then there are parents who don't agree with it, and they can have their child opt out of it. But it doesn't feel like there's an open discussion where disagreements can be aired, and that the discussion can become increasingly nuanced.
Yeah, I think just feels like that from observing modern life today. There's not a lot of nuance going on.
Mhm.
We're doing nuance here, um, but I don't know if that's sort of dominant in not just like in national things, but in just local. I don't think the school board is having a lot of nuance in the in
Mhm.
the debates. It's kind of what you have is sort of organizational consensus. You have a group of people that feel one way, and so they're part of an organization, and now the egos of the individuals have conformed into a group ego, and so now that group has to fight for the survival of its views, and it can't be vulnerable. And then the other group has the same thing going on, and so um that's also where I think like it's a dead end. But if you then start saying, all right, well, how can we bring people together and try to form a new framework or some kind of consensus that's based on a different way of looking at things, and still there's going to be disagreements. There's going to be parts where I can't participate in some version of that, or we have to negotiate it differently because that's my red line is there, whatever it might be. But I think like I think we need nuance, and that's why I also brought up like I didn't want to sit and like go through all the things in the curriculum that I don't necessarily like at what age, and it's just not like there's plenty of outrage. What we need to do is part of what we need to do is see what do we think is missing in something.
Yeah.
Because again, these are the things we're talking about have transcended. They've existed throughout human history. They have a transcendent quality to them, and that's how we move forward past ego boundaries and all of these things. Like we need to latch on to something that has transcendent quality. Otherwise we just devolve into hating each other, and
That leads me to a related but different discussion. I don't know how much time we have to go into it, but I was wondering how you feel about parents limiting the books that children read. And I'm talking about classics like Toni Morrison, um, with either sexual or violent content. Um, because, to me, that's also great literature is also something that's transcendent, that can connect people. And, I was wondering how you felt about that.
Yeah, I don't necessarily, in a classical liberal perspective, I don't necessarily, want to start going around banning books.
Hmm.
Um, Again, I'm more concerned with context. Um, and so things make sense when other things make sense first.
So
Uh,
say some more about that.
well, again, in the same way, like we can, I'm not, we shouldn't ban sex ed, but maybe we have to do some other things that are more foundational first. In the same way,
Mhm.
yeah, maybe it's okay to read and discuss certain books, but maybe before we do that, we should establish some other basic principles. So that way, because here's the thing: is media. Let's just speak media in generally, whether it's like classic or modern. Like media really does have the ability to sway young minds. I mean, it's a very powerful force, whether it's literature, whether it's more modern forms of media. It really does. When we have young people whose frontal lobes are still developing, judgment is still developing, they're coming of age. Powerful glossy media images or certain depictions of certain things. Without a proper context, can lead us to a place that may not be always great. So I think again, this is why, and again, even building a foundation of love would be a good starting point to some of that. That's why love education works in so many contexts beyond just like preparing to talk about sex.
Well, I would love to see that happen. I would be totally in support of something like that. But then, then I think about the practicality of it, and what teachers are already being burdened with, and I'll bet you in some sex ed classes that's already happening.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
if the person is really talented
I believe
and
that.
really understands what's important about putting sex in the context of relationships, that would happen naturally. And then there's probably other people that are just following, checking the boxes.
Right, right. Yeah, I bet there's a wide variety of of how it's being taught out there.
Yeah.
So I know, I think we're approaching our hour mark.
Are we?
I don't know, um, but I think that we 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 got we moved in the direction of a framework, which I think is a great accomplishment for an hour.
Yeah, I would, I don't have any, my kids aren't in school anymore. They're grown-ups. So I don't have any way that I would even be able to find out what's going on, in Brooklyn, in the public school system, like, and how sex is being taught. But it seems like it would be really fun and interesting to try to have some kind of a dialogue about that with educators. And you're in a better position than I am with young children. Your kids are going to be entering school soon.
Right, right.
Is that
Uh,
something that you would plan to do, to have a dialogue with the educators?
I'm open-minded. One of the I've thought about this idea of love education, which again I view as separate from sex education. But I
Mhm.
don't know. One idea that a friend floated to me was maybe you know, talking with like a graduate school of education and using them to develop a curriculum that becomes part of a pilot project somewhere. It's kind of one of the things that it has to happen organically when the time is right and it makes sense and you have eager participants that also buy in. Because yeah, it's you don't want it to become another program, another thing teachers have to do, another thing legislators are trying to legislate. It's just another thing on top of all the other things.
Right, right. You would want it to sort of be integrated in something that's already going on in some way, right?
Yeah, yeah. But I think like it has to. You have to kind of see what happens, I suppose.
Yeah.
Keep talking about it. I think that's part of it is just even just discussing it and putting it out there as a thought for discussion. If more people are talking about, well, yeah, why aren't we talking about love in schools? We can be doing that.
Yeah.
then that starts to be a groundswell in itself.
Yeah, it seems like that might take things in a direction where the parents and the educators aren't at odds with each other, but that, maybe this is very idealistic, but that somehow there could be more of a collaboration.
Right. I think, it probably is idealistic, but I also think that then the idealism may meet a practical moment at some point.
Yeah,
Because that's what we have to start doing in general is we, when it's just like two sides just in opposition, I'm usually trying to look for the third lane.
right. I am too.
Yeah, it's just
Yeah, that's good.
have that in common.
Yes, so I hope we talk again.
Yeah, I'd love that. Yeah.
Okay.
Great conversation. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed
Take
it.
care. Yeah, it's a lot of food for thought.
Yes. And looking forward to talking soon.
Okay,
Thanks, Sue.
bye.